Section 1. The Mock Jug Takes to the Sky. April 8, 1943. 27,000 ft above Cologne, Germany. The sky was a hard, thin blue that day, the kind of altitude that makes air taste like metal and turns breath into a private, fogged world inside a brittle oxygen mask. In the cockpit of a Republic, Thunderbolt Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Harrow could feel the Pratt & Whitney R2800's heartbeat through the airframe, a steady, piston-driven thunder that filled the cramped fuselage and set the instruments to a constant tremor. Outside, the leading edges of the wing glittered with rime. Inside, the heater did little more than whisper. His gloves were stiff from cold, his visor rimmed with frost. He could see the contrails of the bomber stream dropping away below like a torn ribbon of white and steel. For months, German pilots had laughed at planes like his. They had a name for the Thunderbolt, the Jug, and the nickname stuck because it sounded dismissive. The Luftwaffe's belief was simple. The P-47 was too heavy, too bulky, a lumbering mass next to the slim Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the fierce Focke-Wulf FW 190. In mess halls and briefing rooms, German aces traded stories of the P-47's supposed slowness and ponderous turn, a target for an experienced hand. Allied pilots had a habit of answering the taunt with a grim smile and a tightened harness. They knew what their machine could do, even if the enemy did not. Harrow glanced right and caught the silver flash of Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemk's Thunderbolt sliding into line. Zemk's aircraft bore the shark-tooth markings and the pride of the 56th Fighter Group, a squadron of men who had been fighting to bend the sky's narrative since they first took the Jug into combat. Zemk's voice crackled over the radio, precise as a metronome. "Wolfpack, hold altitude. We buy altitude, we buy speed. Eyes sharp, angle off the bombers, we're the umbrella." Below them, the B-17s and B-24s drifted like armored elephants, lumbering, massive, and vulnerable. Their gunners were nervous. The flak over the Ruhr district had been heavier in the morning. Harrow watched a bomber's shadow slide across the cloud deck and felt the old, animal wartime fear, the knowledge that the sky could spit death in many forms. He adjusted the throttle and felt the Thunderbolt answer, its broad fuselage seeming to drink the thin air and want more. Then, like a distant ripple, a column of smoke blackened the horizon, a sign that Luftwaffe fighters had intercepted the bomber stream. Harrow's ears pricked. On the radio, Zemk's tone changed from measured to taut. "Enemy at 2 o'clock high climbing. They'll try to slingshot through us, stay tight." The pilots scanned, looking for the quick, angular shapes that signified German fighters, the short, stubby wings of an FW 190 or the sharper silhouette of a Bf 109. The first contacts were at long range, a pair of Messerschmitts peeling from sun glare, the kind of silhouette that in a different plane might have inspired a salute. But these were not to be saluted. Harrow felt Zemk slide forward, then back, breathing the plane in, sighting. "On my mark, down on 'em." It was a command that had become a tactic. Buy altitude, let the enemy commit, then use the Thunderbolt's strength, speed in the dive, ruggedness in a run to punish the attackers. When the dive began, the world telescoped into a rush of air and noise. The Jug shed altitude like a water pitcher spills water, fast, clean, with the pilot trusting the airframe to do what the Luftwaffe said it could not. Harrow's eyes telegraphed to his hands. He eased the stick forward and felt the radial engine climb through its notes until the propeller was a second horizon. 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, came alive with a fierce, staccato bark. The guns were not graceful. They were volcanic, and when they fired, they painted the sky with tracer lines that cut the German fighters in half of their confidence. From above the German formation, the Thunderbolts looked less like jugs and more like falling anvils, massive, inexorable, and lethal. In that first pass, a FW 190 took a line across its tail and rolled into the clouds, smoke unfurling like a black flag. The second pass found a Bf 109 trying to flee low. Harrow followed the German's descent with cold precision, the Thunderbolt's weight helping it slice through thin air where lighter fighters would have struggled to control their speed. The German pilot's silhouette in his sights flinched, his attempt to outturn a P-47 proving useless in the face of raw, diving velocity and concentrated firepower. Inside the Jagdflieger's world below, shock replaced mockery. German radio chatter laced the air terse, then panicked. "What are those things doing? They came from nowhere like thunder," one voice said, disbelief carving through the static. Luftwaffe pilots, who had once called the Jug slow and easy prey, were now forced to rewrite what they thought they knew about aerial combat. The P-47's method, climb high, dive fast, burn long, changed the shape of an encounter. Instead of a turning contest where the lighter fighters felt at home, the Thunderbolt turned the sky into a hunting ground. Harrow's visor steamed. His knuckles bled under the gloves from the strain of repeated control inputs. He did not have time to think of jokes the Germans had told. He had a plane to fly and men below to protect. He lived in the immediacy of throttle, sight picture, and the rattle of spent belts unspooling in the wings. As he climbed back to altitude, hot and exhilarated and smelling of cordite, he looked over his shoulder and saw the bomber stream, battered but still on course. Around him, his squadron caught the light, a pack of broad-winged silhouettes against a wounded sun. Up here, above the flak and the ruin of industrial Germany, a reputation was changing. The Jug that had been mocked was becoming the Jug that hunted. Turning the tide in the skis. By summer 1943, the laughter had stopped. What began as scattered reports of American heavy fighters cutting down Luftwaffe interceptors had grown into a pattern, and patterns in war had consequences. At German airfields from Lille to Münster, mechanics worked through the night to repair bullet-riddled Focke-Wulfs. Pilots returned from missions shaken, muttering about P-47s that dove like meteors, tore through formations, and somehow clawed back to altitude before anyone could catch them. At Debden and Halesworth in England, the 56th and 78th Fighter Groups were rearming. Their mechanics, men whose faces were etched with grime and pride, refueled the Thunderbolts with practiced speed. Empty .50 caliber shells littered the hardstand, the scent of oil and cordite hanging in the damp English air. Between missions, pilots joked in the way men do when they know laughter hides fatigue. "They called us flying jugs," Zemke said once, tugging a flight glove tight, "but turns out this jug pours lead." P-47's secret was not agility. It was power, brute, unapologetic power. The 2,000 horsepower R2800 double Wasp engine made the Thunderbolt the largest single-engine fighter of the war, capable of outrunning or outdiving almost anything in the sky. It could absorb hits that would send other fighters spiraling into the channel. More than one pilot limped home with half a wing missing or an oil line severed, the Jug somehow dragging itself back across the North Sea. Major Robert S. Johnson was one of them. On June 26, 1943, his P-47 was ambushed by an FW-190 flown by German ace Egon Mayer. Johnson's canopy jammed, his instrument panel shattered, and fuel leaked into the cockpit. Mayer closed in, riddling the Jug with shells until his guns finally clicked empty. Johnson, bleeding and barely conscious, somehow coaxed his crippled plane back to England. Ground crews counted 21 cannon and machine gun hits, and yet the P-47 had refused to die. From that day, the Luftwaffe learned to respect the Jug's armor as much as its firepower. High above the clouds, tactics evolved as quickly as the planes themselves. American pilots learned that altitude was life. From 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt could pick its fights diving with gravity's blessing and then zooming away before the lighter 109s could retaliate. Boom and zoom, they called it. No turning duels, no dogfights in tight circles. Just cold calculation. Strike fast, hit hard, and live to strike again. By late 1943, Thunderbolts weren't just bodyguards for bombers, they were hunters. They ranged far ahead of the formations, looking for the first glint of sunlight on a German canopy. Luftwaffe pilots began to dread the distinctive roar of the R2800 echoing above the cloud line. It meant death could fall on them in seconds. A German ace named Hans Ulrich Wehner later admitted, At first, we thought them slow, easy. Then one day they came from the sun, guns blazing, and my wingman vanished. You could hit them, but they did not fall. For the Americans, the war in the air had shifted. The Thunderbolt's weight, once mocked, became its shield. Its engine's thunder became its warning. And its pilots, the young men who had learned to dive instead of dance, began to write a new rule-book for aerial warfare. Still, there was one problem: the Jug's range. It could escort bombers deep into occupied France, but not yet into the heart of Germany. Each mission ended with the same grim ritual: watching the B-17s and B-24s continue eastward without them, unprotected, toward the black curtain of flak and fighters over Schweinfurt or Regensburg. The Thunderbolts had to turn back, fuel running low, leaving their bomber crews to face the worst alone. The pilots hated it. Zemk hated it most of all. "We fly home," he once said, "while the boys we guard burn their way through hell." That frustration drove the next evolution of the Thunderbolt and the next chapter of its legend. Engineers back home were already at work, extending the Jug's reach, fitting it with drop tanks and more efficient fuel systems. Soon, it would no longer just defend the bombers. It would carry the fight deep into the Reich itself. For now, though, as twilight fell over the airfields of East Anglia, mechanics wiped their hands on oil-stained rags, and pilots gathered for the next briefing. The laughter of the enemy had faded into silence. The Jug, once mocked as a brute, had become the sound of American thunder rolling over Europe. Thunder over Germany. January 11th, 1944, 25,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. The bomber stream stretched for miles, silver arrows slicing through a sky the color of gunmetal. Below, the Reich's industrial heartland shimmered with smoke and flak bursts, black petals blooming upward. At the head of the escort group flew Colonel Hub Zemk and his 56th Fighter Group, Zemk's Wolf Pack. Their mission: keep the Luftwaffe off the bombers long enough for them to reach the ball-bearing factories below. Zemk's canopy rattled from the buffet of turbulent air. He scanned the horizon, the world reduced to dials, vapor trails, and instinct. The radio hissed with half-choked chatter. Someone spotted movement above the contrails. Then, out of the pale winter sun, came the German counterattack. Dozens of Bf-109s and Fw-190s dove from altitude, the sunlight catching their wingtips in a deadly sparkle. The Luftwaffe's plan was familiar: swarm the bombers before their escorts could respond. But this time, the Jugs were waiting high above. Zemk's voice snapped through the radio like a whip. "Wolfpack, let 'em come, then hit 'em from the top." Harrow and the other Thunderbolt pilots pushed their throttles forward. The R-2800 engines roared, shaking their cockpits as the P-47s rolled, inverted, and plunged. The dive was deafening, the kind of speed that made air feel like concrete. The altimeter needles spun wildly as they plummeted toward the German formation below. The first pass was pure chaos. The P-47s came in screaming from 30,000 feet, firing bursts that ripped through enemy formations before the Germans even knew they were under attack. The heavy Jugs, almost twice the weight of a Bf-109, didn't turn, they fell, bringing down ruin in their wake. Harrow squeezed the trigger, the vibration of 8 Brownings pounding through his chest. A stream of tracers walked across an Fw-190's fuselage. The German fighter caught fire instantly, rolling into a black spiral of smoke. "Splash one, splash one," a voice yelled over the comms, high-pitched and raw with adrenaline. The Luftwaffe's disciplined attack dissolved into frantic maneuvers. German pilots tried to climb out of reach, but the Thunderbolts simply climbed higher. Those who tried to dive away found the Jugs on their tails, gaining speed in a dive no German engine could match. In the confusion, one Fw-190 cut across Harrow's path, banking hard left. He yanked the stick, the Thunderbolt groaning under the strain. The German pulled into a climb, a fatal mistake. Harrow's sights settled just below the enemy's tailplane. He fired again. The tracers caught the belly of the 190, and the aircraft exploded in a burst of orange and black. Debris clattered against his canopy. Minutes later, the sky was littered with parachutes. Below, the bombers pressed on, engines droning steadily through a corridor of smoke and falling aircraft. By the time Zemk called break off, the airspace over Aschersleben was a ruin of contrails, fire, and drifting debris. The 56th Fighter Group had claimed 38 confirmed kills, their highest one-day total of the war so far. The Luftwaffe's defenders, once kings of Europe's skis, limped home with shattered wings and fewer aces than they'd begun with. On the ground, in smoking German hangars, mechanics stared at what was left of their squadrons. The reports came in one after another. Losses heavy, Thunderbolts attacked from above, impossible speed in the dive. Even General Adolf Galland, the famed Luftwaffe ace, admitted privately that the new American tactics were tearing holes in their defenses faster than they could patch them. That winter, the balance of air power over Europe began to shift, not just because of numbers, but because of evolution. The P-47 had grown teeth. It wasn't the laughingstock of 1943 anymore. It was the anvil upon which Germany's air force was breaking. In briefing huts across England, pilots pinned new kill markings beneath their canopies. Zemk, ever the strategist, stood before his men with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen disbelief turn into fear. "They thought we couldn't fight their way," he said, "so we made them fight ours." The men cheered. Outside, the fog thickened over the airfield. Mechanics fueled the next sortie in silence, knowing dawn would bring another mission. But tonight, for once, they allowed themselves a smile. Because high above Europe, thunder no longer meant storm clouds. It meant the P-47 was coming. From escort to executioner. Spring 1944. The fields of occupied Europe were greening again, but the skies above them were still full of fire. The Allied air offensive had entered its decisive phase. Every day, hundreds of bombers crossed the Channel, bound for German factories, refineries, and rail yards. And every day, the P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked as the flying jug, led the way. But something new was happening. The jugs were no longer just protecting bombers. They were now hunting on their own. Lieutenant Harrow's squadron had been retasked for what the pilots jokingly called rhubarb runs, low-level sweeps across enemy territory to strafe trains, convoys, and airfields. It was a different kind of war. No altitude advantage now. No calm blue horizon. Down low, the air was thick with flak, mud, and terror. April 20th, 1944, northern France. Harrow's Thunderbolt skimmed just 50 feet above the tree line, its silver belly flashing in the morning light. Below, a German freight train snaked along the tracks, black smoke rising from its locomotive. Over the radio, his flight lead's voice was calm but sharp. "Target ahead, 2 passes, make M count." Harrow rolled in, nose down, and lined up the train's engine in his sights. The Brownings erupted, 8 tongues of fire cutting through the air. The rounds tore through the engine housing, sending steam and sparks geysering into the sky. A heartbeat later, the ammunition car went up, a blinding orange explosion that rocked his jug from below. He pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces crush his chest. Black smoke filled the cockpit for a moment before he burst through into clean air. Behind him, the train burned like a torch, and another Thunderbolt swooped down to rake the cars with cannon fire. What had once been a defensive fighter was now a precision instrument of destruction. The P-47's rugged airframe and heavy firepower made it ideal for ground attack. It could take hits, shrug off flak, and still bring its pilot home, something few aircraft could claim. By mid-1944, entire Luftwaffe airfields were being annihilated by Thunderbolt strafing runs before their fighters could even get off the ground. But the evolution came at a cost. The closer they flew to the ground, the more the risk multiplied. Harrow had seen 2 of his friends vanish in bursts of flak. Another had clipped a tree during a low pass and never pulled out. Each time the squadron returned, One or two fewer planes sat on the hardstand. Still, morale remained iron. Every mission brought the war closer to Germany's doorstep, and the pilots had begun to notice something subtle, something chilling. The Luftwaffe's response was weakening. The once feared German interceptors appeared less and less often. When they did, their pilots were younger, less experienced. The veterans were gone, either dead or grounded. One evening, Zemk gathered his men in the ready room. The air reeked of sweat, coffee, and burnt aviation fuel. The colonel stood beside a map dotted with red pins. His voice was low but carried through the room. A year ago, they called our jugs slow and clumsy. Now they can't climb without watching for us. You've turned this brute of a plane into a legend. Remember that tomorrow when we go in again. We don't just fly, we dominate. The men nodded, wordless. They weren't fighting for glory anymore, just survival and each other. Yet they all knew what Zemk meant. The laughter that had once followed the P-47 had become silence, and that silence was victory. By the time the Normandy invasion began in June 1944, the Thunderbolt had become the backbone of Allied air power. While the sleek new P-51 Mustangs stole headlines for their long-range escort missions, it was the P-47 that carved up the German war machine on the ground: tank columns, supply depots, rail lines. Every German soldier who looked up and saw the wide wings of a jug knew what was coming. A thunderous roar, a storm of .50 caliber fire, and the inescapable shadow of defeat. As D-Day approached, Harrow's unit was briefed on its new role: close air support for the landings. No more deep strikes or high-altitude hunts. This time, they would fly just above the surf, protecting the soldiers storming the beaches. Zemk's final words that night carried the weight of every loss and every victory they'd lived through. They laughed at us once. Tomorrow, they'll remember our sound. When the boys hit those beaches, the last thing the enemy will hear is thunder. Thunder at D-Day. June 6, 1944, Normandy coast, France. The first light of dawn broke over the English Channel, turning the water into a sheet of dull silver. Beneath the clouds, the greatest armada in history moved steadily toward France. Over 5,000 ships filled the horizon: battleships, destroyers, landing craft, their wakes tracing white scars through the sea. And above them, the sky thrummed with wings. Among the roar of engines, the deep growl of the P-47 Thunderbolt stood out like distant thunder rolling across the waves. Lieutenant Harrow and his squadron from Zemk's Wolf Pack flew low, just 1,000 feet above the invasion fleet. The radio was alive with clipped voices, each one layered over the other: bombardment reports, altitude calls, gunfire from ships below. The horizon was alive with flashes, the opening bombardment of the Normandy defenses. Harrow's cockpit vibrated as flak began to rise from the coastline ahead. Black puffs dotted the sky like spreading ink stains. He could see the beaches now, Utah and Omaha, a blur of smoke, fire, and chaos. Landing craft crawled through the surf, soldiers pouring out into waist-deep water under a hail of machine gun fire. "Wolfpack, stay tight," Zemk ordered over the radio. "We're the shield. No strafing until the word." The squadron formed into a broad wedge, circling above the beachhead like hawks waiting for the storm to clear. Through the smoke, Harrow saw German positions firing down from concrete bunkers. Every burst of tracer fire felt like a dagger thrown upward. Then came the order. "Wolfpack, hit those guns, make it count." Harrow peeled off and rolled into a dive. The wind screamed past his canopy as he dropped through the cloud of flak. He leveled off just above the dunes and lined up on a gun battery. 8.50 caliber Brownings roared in unison, chewing through concrete and sandbags. The first burst silenced a machine gun nest. The second struck an ammunition dump. The explosion rippled through the ground like a miniature earthquake. Pulling out of the dive, Harrow looked down and saw soldiers in olive drab pushing inland, tiny figures moving through the smoke and chaos. The sight filled him with something beyond fear or pride, a sense of purpose sharpened to a knife's edge. Every burst from his guns, every strafing run, meant more men lived to see another hour on that beach. He climbed back toward the formation, breathing hard, sweat slicking his neck beneath his flight helmet. On his right, a Thunderbolt trailed smoke, its pilot struggling to gain altitude. "I'm hit," came the voice over the radio, strained but steady. Harrow watched the damaged jug limp toward the channel. The pilot made it out of range, then belayed. His parachute blossomed white against the gray sea. There was no time to dwell. The German defenses were crumbling under the combined assault, naval guns, rocket fire, and airstrikes. Zemke's Wolfpack made pass after pass, silencing artillery, cutting roads, shredding convoys racing toward the beaches. By midday, the air above Normandy was thick with exhaust and gunpowder. The P-47s, filthy with grime and bullet holes, returned to England only long enough to refuel before heading out again. Their heavy wings left shadows over a battlefield that was slowly, painfully, turning in the Allies' favor. That night back at the airfield, Harrow sat on an overturned crate beside his Thunderbolt. Its paint was blistered, its wings pockmarked from shrapnel. He ran a hand over the fuselage, over the faint outline of the words stenciled beneath the cockpit. Lucky Lil. Around him, the ground crews worked in silence, patching holes, refilling ammo belts. A mechanic muttered, "You boys made history today." Harrow didn't answer. He looked westward toward France, where the flashes of distant artillery still lit the horizon. The P-47 had come a long way from being laughed at in German briefings to becoming the hammer of D-Day. It wasn't the sleekest, it wasn't the fastest, but it was the one that kept coming back, mission after mission, no matter how torn or battered. And for the men on those beaches, that sound, the deep, rolling thunder above the waves, was the sound of salvation. The day the Luftwaffe fell silent. Autumn 1944, the sky over Europe had changed. The Luftwaffe that once ruled the clouds was crumbling. Every factory that could produce fighters was under constant bombardment. Every airfield that launched them was hunted by Thunderbolts before sunrise. The once proud German squadrons, the Jagdschwader, were a shadow of their former selves. The laughter, the swagger, the arrogance that had filled their ready rooms in 1940 was gone, replaced by exhaustion and disbelief. In the low, foggy dawn of September 11th, Lieutenant Harrow climbed into his P-47 at a base near Cambrai, France. His squadron was part of the great Allied push toward the German border. Below them, armored divisions rolled eastward through the wreckage of retreating Wehrmacht units. Their orders were simple: sweep ahead of the front lines, destroy anything that moved. The Thunderbolt was no longer a defensive escort fighter. It was a relentless executioner. They crossed the Meuse River just after sunrise, flying at treetop height. The fields below were scarred with tank tracks and blackened wrecks. The smoke of burning fuel hung over the countryside like fog. "Train on the rail line north of Liege," came the call over the radio. Harrow's formation turned in unison, their silver wings flashing against the dawn. He spotted the target first, a long, dark column of freight cars fleeing east. "Visual on target," he called. "Wolfpack going in." The squadron dropped to 50 feet, skimming over the treetops. The first pass was surgical, a rake of fire down the locomotive, the explosion shattering the quiet countryside. Cars toppled, scattering flames and twisted steel along the tracks. Harrow's second burst caught a line of trucks on a nearby road, setting off secondary explosions. When they pulled up again, the world below them was chaos. Smoke trails curled upward, staining the morning sky. It was brutal work, fast, mechanical, impersonal, but it was the final dismantling of the enemy's war machine. Every road destroyed, every train shattered, was one more step toward ending the war. Then came the radio warning: "Bandits 9 o'clock high." Harrow craned his neck. Through the haze, dark specks appeared: Messerschmitt Bf-109s, maybe a dozen of them, streaking in from the east. For the first time in weeks, the Luftwaffe had shown its teeth. Zemk's voice, steady and calm, broke through the noise. "Wolfpack, climb and engage. Let's finish this." The jugs rose sharply, engines howling. The air battle that followed was short, 10 minutes of pure fury. The Thunderbolts used altitude, speed, and overwhelming firepower to dominate the fight. Harrow caught one Messerschmitt climbing too steeply. He rolled in behind it and fired a long burst. The German fighter disintegrated mid-air, fragments glittering like shards of glass in the sunlight. A second 109 dove away, desperate to escape, but the P-47 could dive faster. Harrow's altimeter spun as he pursued, the landscape rushing upward. He waited until the last moment, then fired, a storm of tracers striking the target squarely. The 109 hit the ground in a fiery plume. And then silence. The surviving German pilots fled east, their radios crackling with frantic chatter. The sky was empty once more. As the squadron regrouped, Zemk's voice came through the headset, quieter now. "Boys, that might be the last real fight they've got left." He was right. That engagement, later recorded as one of the Luftwaffe's last major appearances in the Western Front's daylight skies, marked the end of an era. The Reich's once invincible air force was gone, bled dry by attrition, and overwhelmed by Allied industry and tactics. When the Thunderbolts landed back in Cambrai, mechanics counted the bullet holes, hundreds of them across the squadron's wings and fuselages. Yet every plane had made it home. The crews, exhausted and filthy, leaned against their aircraft. Staring into the quiet afternoon, for the first time in years, the sky over Europe felt safe. Harrow removed his oxygen mask and looked eastward. Smoke drifted along the horizon. Germany lay beyond that haze. He thought of the young German pilots they had just fought, barely trained, outnumbered and outgunned. The war had turned them all into ghosts waiting for their final mission. In the distance, another squadron of P-47s thundered overhead, heading toward the front. The sound filled the airfield, deep, rolling, unstoppable. It was no longer the joke of the Luftwaffe. It was the sound of the Reich's defeat approaching on wings of steel. From jug to legend. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Across airfields from France to Belgium, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts sat lined in perfect rows, their once battle-scarred fuselages now gleaming in the sun. The laughter and disbelief that had once echoed from German pilots had long vanished. What remained was a grudging, universal respect. The flying jug, that heavy, stubby machine they'd mocked, had outlasted them all. By the final months of the war, the P-47 had flown over 746,000 combat sorties. It had destroyed thousands of tanks, trains, and aircraft. In the air, it became the backbone of America's fighter command, the silent guardian of every bomber that crossed the channel. On the ground, it was a thunderous scythe, clearing the way for Patton's advance and smashing German supply lines to rubble. Its pilots had grown to love it fiercely. Many called it the plane that brought them home. Captain Robert S. Johnson, one of the war's top American aces, once described being riddled with bullets by a German FW-190 oil spraying across his windscreen, control cables shredded, yet the Thunderbolt refused to die. He limped back over the channel, trailing smoke, and landed with the aircraft nearly torn in half. "It should have been impossible," he said later, "but the jug just wouldn't quit." Even the Luftwaffe's best began to notice.
Captured German pilots told Allied interrogators they dreaded facing the P-47s that dove out of the sun. Its size and sound became symbols of doom. The roar of its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, a 2,000 horsepower monster, was often the last thing they heard before their cockpit filled with fire. The Thunderbolt's dominance wasn't just brute power. It was the perfection of tactics. Early in the war, American pilots had tried to dogfight on the Germans' terms, turning tightly, losing altitude, and dying needlessly. But by 1944, the air war had evolved. The P-47's pilots learned to fight differently, climb higher, strike from above, and dive like a hammer from heaven. High-altitude boom and zoom attacks turned its weight into a weapon. One German ace described it bitterly in a post-war interview. You cannot turn with it. You cannot climb with it. But you could never escape it. It came from the clouds, killed you, and was gone. By then, the nickname Jug had changed meaning. No longer an insult, it became a badge of honor. When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine and rolled into Germany, Thunderbolts flew overhead, strafing the last convoys retreating east. They covered the paratroopers at the Rhine crossings, pounded flak positions, and silenced the last desperate defenders of Hitler's crumbling empire. And then, on May 8, 1945, V-Day, the great Thunderbolts stood silent. Lieutenant Harrow, now a veteran of over 80 missions, walked across a quiet airstrip near Bremen. The air smelled of spring grass and engine oil. The sky above, once a place of terror and death, was calm again. As the sun sank over the ruins of Europe, the silhouette of the Thunderbolt gleamed against the golden light. It had been mocked, dismissed, underestimated, but in the end, it was unstoppable. The flying Jug had become something more than a machine. It was a symbol of endurance, of power, of the moment the hunters became the hunted. And for every pilot who climbed into its cockpit, the memory of that sound, that deep, unrelenting roar, would echo for the rest of their lives. Subscriber.